Hello, my name is Kaylee Ralston, and I'll be doing my presentation on the role of restorative justice in family centered programs in reducing recidivism from a social work perspective. I currently am receiving my master's in social work with an organizational leadership focus and a specific focus on forensic social work. So, for my thesis, my project aims to analyze major problems within the criminal justice system and determine the effectiveness of implementing restorative justice and family centered programs within that justice system. I'll specifically be reviewing the impact that utilizing social workers within the justice system has on recidivism rates, on rehabilitation, and on long term outcomes for the accused, the victims, and their family members. It is my belief that integrating restorative justice and family centered programs through social workers into the criminal justice system can significantly reduce recidivism rates. So, we're going to review that. So, for the problem at hand, this problem is mass incarceration and high recidivism rates in America. Recidivism is defined as the tendency for an offender to reoffend after a previous conviction. So, according to a study by the Department of Justice that was reviewing rates from 2012 to 2017, 71% of released individuals were arrested again within 5 years of that release. This statistic alone shows us that there is a clear need for the issue to be addressed in new and creative ways. Data collected by our government consistently shows us that Black individuals are overrepresented in the criminal justice system and recidivism rates, and that's relative to the overall population. So we know that there is issues with that as well. We know that there is systemic racism within the justice system as a whole, and this has led to advocacy for alternative approaches to addressing systemic inequalities. Oftentimes, social workers are leading the charge for that advocacy. The United States have attempted to address the issues, but few approaches have been adequate up until very recently. So let's look at a timeline of the legal approaches over time. We need to bear in mind that many of these have been historically ineffective, and we'll look at when they begin to get a little bit better for the community. We're specifically going to be looking at legal steps that have been taken regarding nonviolent offenses. So, in the early 1970s, Nixon declared a war on drugs, stating that drug abuse was public enemy number one. With that came everything like mandatory sentencing and anti drug abuse that we're going to be talking about. So, mandatory sentencing laws came into effect in 1984, and these required that nonviolent drug offenses would receive pre-approved sentencing regardless of external factors. This led to lengthy sentences and additional barriers to reentry, and also contributed to mass incarceration for low-level crimes. In 1986, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act was created to install mandatory minimums for specific drugs. An example is the punishment for crack being drastically tougher than cocaine, which led to stark racial disparities in drug-related crimes, which then connects back to the historical racial disparities within the justice system. Next came the 1994 Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. This enacted the three strikes law, creating harsh punishments for three-time offenders regardless of the crime. The outcome was prioritizing punishment over rehabilitation and increasing mass incarceration. So finally, in 2007, the Second Chance Act was introduced. This funded rehabilitation programs with the goal of reducing recidivism. This was the first major shift in federal support, but it still wasn't doing everything that we needed it to do. From here, there was more progress and funding and advocating for true reform. So in 2010, the Fair Sentencing Act was implemented by Obama. It altered required sentencing that we talked about before for crack versus cocaine with the goal of addressing those racial disparities within the justice system. It is important to note that it still did not put crack and cocaine on a level playing field, but it did make strides in making it more fair. So, the significant issue: why is addressing recidivism through alternative practices so important? So, punitive models do not properly rehabilitate offenders, so it's important that we find alternative ways of confronting crime rates and high incarceration rates. Traditional approaches focus more on punishment rather than healing and regularly fail to recognize the root causes of criminal behavior, which leads to continued criminal behavior and sometimes even generational criminal behavior. Many causes can be tied to poverty, to generational or individual trauma, and to a lack of social support. So, restorative justice practices, on the other hand, prioritize healing and harm caused by criminal behavior. And we're going to go over what some of those things look like now. You can see in the graphic that the criminal justice system asks what law was broken, who broke it, and how are we going to punish them, where restorative justice looks more at what harm was done and who was that harm done to, what needs came out based on that harm, and whose obligation is it to meet those needs. What is restorative justice? So, restorative justice is a practice that brings offenders and families together to address the harm caused by crime. The goal is for the offender to take ownership of their actions and behaviors in front of the victims. And with that, victims are also given time and space to be able to have their voices heard, which oftentimes maintains a sense of control over the crime for that victim. In a recent study completed by the Department of Health at Yale University, it found that participants of restorative justice programs had a 26% recidivism rate compared to the control group, which reflected a 40% recidivism rate. So we can see that recidivism rate lowers when we're using restorative justice techniques. It's important to note, however, that restorative justice may not be appropriate for all offenders, specifically violent offenders. In that case, they would likely be sentenced to prison time with the goal of protecting the community. Success in this program requires the offender to take true responsibility for their actions. Some people see this as a quote, get out of jail free card, and that is not the case. It's important that it is closely monitored. In order for it to be effective, there needs to be respect, accountability, healing, and empathy. Those are all necessary components for all parties in order for this to be an effective technique. So now let's move on to family-centered programs. So what are family-centered programs? They're somewhat of an extension of restorative justice, and it addresses the needs within the entire family dynamic. So many problems arise when parents enter the justice system, from losing income for remaining family members to risking foster care involvement. The effect of low-level crimes can be detrimental to many families. Family-centered programs are interventions specifically designed to strengthen the relationship between the incarcerated and their families, leading to more positive outcomes once they're re-entered into the community. With family-centered programs, children are able to interact with their incarcerated parents in more humanistic ways. This looks like the use of child-friendly visitations, rigorous reentry planning with social workers, utilizing support services given to them by social workers, and educating the parents on the impact of incarceration and the outcome for families post-incarceration is proven to improve upon. Social workers are important because they know that fostering relationships lowers negative behaviorals at all levels, which leads to lower outcomes of crime for those previously incarcerated and also for the following generations. So, the benefits of utilizing a social worker in these spaces. Social workers are uniquely equipped to facilitate and assist with restorative justice and family centered approaches because they maintain a holistic and trauma informed lens. They also have the education and background needed to understand family and community systems. Social workers also have training in understanding and identifying trauma and the impact of trauma that takes place, and this makes them uniquely qualified to implement alternative practices from a trauma-informed approach. We know that those who have experienced immense trauma are more likely to commit crimes or face the criminal justice system, so it's important that we have workers that understand that dynamic to be here to help. They're capable of conflict resolution within various family dynamics, and they have the mindset needed to really support reunification from an objective point of view. They're also deeply tied to the NASW Code of Ethics and Values, which means that they're trained in cultural competence and advocacy and empathy and non judgmental approaches to non traditional family dynamics. So, overall, it is my stance that social workers should play a large role in our collective efforts to reduce recidivism through the implementation of restorative justice and family centered programs. They are uniquely qualified because they are trained in trauma informed care, family systems, and advocacy at varying levels. High crime and incarceration rates and recidivism rates need to be addressed for the sake of offenders, victims, families, and the community as a whole. Social workers have the unique background needed that has the potential to implement and support long term generational change within the justice system. In order to impact true change, we need teams of lawyers, social workers, police officers. Those are all needed to approach the problem at all levels and perspectives. There is research and data that proves non traditional approaches lead to more positive outcomes, lower incarceration rates, and improved community responsibility. Here are my references, and I appreciate y'all listening to my presentation. Thank you.